Senator Castleberry, Senator Gerard Rockwell, Amy Miller, Mary Carroll and Mick McMahon. I would also like to thank Glasnevin Trust and their staff and everyone here for taking the time to attend this event today, especially the relatives of those soldiers who died during our tragic Civil War. As many of you may know, I have written a book called The Forgotten Fallen, which was published by Kilmainham Tales back in 2019, thanks to my very dear friend, the late Micheál Ó Dubhlin. This project took me several years of research to complete, and it tells the story of what happened to the forgotten national soldiers. It has taken me on a journey across the whole of Ireland, to museums, to archives, to libraries, to battle and ambush sites, and to every description of cemetery and graveyard in the country, in the hope of finding their final resting places, many of which, I am sad to say, are still unmarked to this day. It also took me into the very homes of some of their descendants, when and where I could locate them, who kindly shared with me personal stories about these men, and indeed artefacts that belonged to them, which often included photographs, letters, and other items that were on their person when they died. But no matter where I went or who I visited, I was always made feel more than welcome. And as I'd sit and listen with my notebook and pen in hand, I learned that almost every story ended with a similar sad reflection, and that was how their loved ones had been forgotten by a government they died trying to defend, and whose government today wouldn't exist without the sacrifices that these men made. Which moves me to quote historian Anne Dolan: "Nothing robbed the Free State soldier of his dignity more than his government's treatment of his memory." In all, over 1,000 national soldiers died over the course of the Civil War. Of those, 488 were killed in action, died from wounds, died as a result of shrapnel explosions, or were murdered and executed. A further 207 died in various accidental circumstances, and 69 died of natural causes. 183 of those soldiers are buried here in the National Army plot and elsewhere throughout this cemetery. However, the graves of the majority of those who died lay scattered throughout the country. Besides General Michael Collins, the soldiers we remember here today, or many of them, were 1916 Rising and War of Independence veterans, and it was great to see our Defence Forces partake in the 1916 centenary celebrations, an army whose formation certainly hit the ground running and was literally born fighting. It would be very wrong to surmise, as some historians have, that our National Army emerged from the Civil War, because such an assumption is similar to a genealogist telling you that your ancestry began with your father. For although the National Army came to fruition in 1922, its roots are firmly embedded with the Irish Volunteers of 1916, and later with their predecessors in the IRA during the War of Independence, who had just finished the war with the British 6 months previously, and were then required during the transition period from a guerrilla force to a regular army to fight another battle, only this time against old comrades. The ferocity of the struggle itself did not diminish, and under the Emergency Powers Act passed by the Dáil on the 28th of September 1922, 77 plus men were executed, when the opposing side embarked on a policy of assassination of members of government. Executions that tarnished the Leo Varadkar once correctly described as state-sanctioned murder. Although those executions cannot be justified, what also cannot be justified were the executions of National Army soldiers by anti-treaty forces, something we hear very little about today, if anything at all. Bitter as our Civil War was, it was not the first time that Irishmen allowed enormous amounts of unnecessary suffering upon themselves in the fight for Irish freedom, by allowing dissension to grow within their ranks. In a pre-election speech given at the Mansion House in 1914, one minister lamented that it was an indisputable fact that we who have always been tolerant towards our enemies have never shown tolerance towards each other. Throughout the centuries, we as Irishmen were all anxious for unity and knew from bitter experiences the evil effects of discord. But how many of those men and women were prepared to sacrifice their personal opinions in the interest of unity they professed to espouse? Each party stood rigidly on its own pedestal and invited the rest of Ireland to gather round and hear the one true gospel of liberty, which generally consisted of abuse hurled at anyone who did not agree with the party in question. Each side was so convinced of the soundness of its policy that it would not recede one pace from the attitude it had taken up, even though that one pace may have meant the union of our national forces and the guarantee of our nation's safety. Pride very often overcame patriotism and forethought and has been accountable for many of our splits in the past. And there will not be found a more lamentable record of internal strife than that furnished in the history of Ireland from the earliest of times right up to the present day. To me, these men we remember here today are Ireland's forgotten fallen, not by their families, of course. And as we have now arrived at the centenary of the Civil War, it is important to acknowledge the deaths of these men, and indeed all those who died on both sides, including the innocent civilians. It is also important that we embrace our past, respect it, and educate ourselves about it, and be aware of it and treasure it. But we must also not make the mistake of living in it, for to do so would be a great disrespect to those who died on both sides of this tragic conflict that was the Irish Civil War. Gura míle maith go